Welcome back to Drafting the Past, a podcast about the craft of writing history. I'm Kate Carpenter, and I'm happy to be back after a few months hiatus. I hope you are ready to dive back into talking about writing, because I have a whole bunch of great interviews ready to go for you. First up is one I am especially excited about. In this episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by historian Dr. Ruby Lal.
Thank you, Kate. I'm really excited about this conversation.
When I first started thinking about this interview more than a year ago, I read Ruby's book, Vagabond Princess: The Great Adventures of Gulbadan. I was swept away by the book, which is a biography of Princess Gulbadan in the early decades of the Mughal Empire. Ruby is also the author of Empress: The Astonishing Reign of Nur Jahan, another remarkable narrative about a remarkable woman in the Mughal Empire. But before I even had a chance to interview her, Ruby came out with another project, Tiger Slayer, which she describes as an illustrated remix of Empress for a young adult audience. I can't tell you how excited I was to talk about all of these projects and how Ruby brings these narratives from hundreds of years ago to life in such vibrant, enchanting books. Dr. Ruby Lal is a professor of South Asian history at Emory University. In addition to the books I've already mentioned, she's also the author of 2 academic books, Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World and Coming of Age in 19th Century India, The Girl Child and the Art of Playfulness. And as you're about to hear, she thinks deeply and beautifully about crafting historical narrative and the stakes of bringing these stories to readers of all ages. Here's my conversation with Dr. Ruby Lal.
Basically, I'm trained as an academic historian. I grew up in India. I did my early degrees there. And then I went off to Oxford in England to do a PhD. And that because a lot of the archival sources I work with are housed in the British Library in London and other places. And then I came to the United States. Johns Hopkins was my first institutional home. And now I teach at Emory University. But really, so I did, a couple of academic books. I am a Mughal historian. And right from the start, there were 2 things that were really of great interest to me, which is why I became a Mughal historian. One is, various forms of storytelling that I grew up with. So these were very much part of my consciousness, although in the late 90s, when I was training to be an academic historian, what we have today, this great interest in storytelling as history really wasn't the thing. The other thing that interested me particularly about the Mughal Empire was that, despite phenomenal histories, they were mostly male histories written by men about men, agriculture, institutions, military victories, wars, what have you, all, classically male enterprises. And, that it was a big gap, I felt, as a beginning student at that time. I felt that the whole world was missing. So, those were the early points. So I did that work and wrote a couple of books, particularly about the feminine experiences in the Mughal Empire. My first academic book is called Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World, in which I really, went after this whole idea called the harem, which was taken for granted. Imagine that women always lived in the harem, and yet, people didn't care to find out what really it was. And basically, I was fascinated by the Mughals because this was an itinerant dynasty. We are talking the pre-nation states in the world. And like much of the world, people were moving and migrating, conquering, building homes. So the harem really wasn't there in the early stages. So I charted that history. Anyway, over time, as I was finishing my second academic book, an editor in India asked me whether I would write, these are her words. She said, there is no definitive history of Nur Jahan. Would I write that? And I got very excited. And I also, of course, started scolding myself because I had grown up hearing Nur Jahan's story from my mother as a girl. So somewhere along the line, it was seeped in my consciousness. But anyway, so I, decided to do this book. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was the moment in which I wanted to, place the only woman ruler of the empire onto the world stage. But also, second, this was my chance to really bring together, history and storytelling. Both concepts, as it were, are really up for grabs for me, have always been. So this is really the trajectory from very solid archival work, but also in that I was mapping the feminine. I was thinking about these, vast experiences of human life that have gone missing. And once you delve into them, histories look very, very different. So that, in a nutshell, is how I moved.
You're such a beautiful writer. Did you always see yourself as a writer? I mean, was craft always a focus for you?
It's I will say outright that people in the academy don't think seriously about writing as a craft. It's a very valuable form of writing, which is academic debate. It's laden with jargon. It takes a lot of strength to think through those things. I think there are great philosophies. So I come from that strength. So I thought more about philosophy of history. I thought more about feminist. So the work was very kind of rich, I think, and supple with feminist thought, highly theoretical, those sorts of things. It's only when I moved with the third book, which is Empress, the Astonishing Reign of Noor Jahan, that I began to take, not only because I was writing nonfiction, but also there was this whole inheritance I had, right, of storytelling. What did storytelling mean? I mean, that was not a given to me. I think it's commonly touted about, oh, set the scene, write story. But to me, I had to really think. I had to think what storytelling would mean for me. I mean, I wanted to capture, for instance, just to be concrete, how would I capture the glint in my mother's eye as she told me the story of this amazing, woman? So that the storytelling in which both the writer, the reader, listener, everybody is transformed, and so is the story, right? How was I going to capture all of these things, and yet at the same time keeping very much the integrity of the archive? It's a lush but very complicated archive that I work with. So yeah, that's where I actively got into craft, and it has not left me. I mean, since Empress, I've done 2 other books, and I'm going on to do more. So it's the craft in the end that's bored me.
Well, I'd like to ask some nosy questions about your writing process. So when and where do you like to do your writing?
I never do my writing at work. That is never at Emory. That office space is mainly for students, for teaching, for meetings. I have these very demarcated ways of working, but they seem to work really well for me. In Atlanta, my working space is this, where we are talking. It's surrounded by books. As you can see, there is a Mughal screen behind us. There are all sorts of things from of the people that I write about, the fabrics, the lush materiality of that world. So this is really where I write much of the time. Of course, when I was completing my second last volume, Vagabond Princess, that I wrote, the entire first draft I wrote in Sweden. It was COVID, and I was on an international fellowship. And, it was extraordinary to be writing about one of the most itinerant women in this dynasty while, we were locked down. You could not move. So that was a really beautiful experience of silence.
How do you like to organize your research?
With the academic books, there was a lot of, it was, again, sort of, the word I used was demarcated. The research part happened first. And then at some point, when I was very bogged down by research, I thought, gosh, now I have to give this some frame. And the same story actually continued with Empress. I wrote down first, my first draft of Empress was really what my Norton editor, when she looked at it, she said, oh God, this is a Cambridge University Press draft. And I had intended it to be that way because It had to be very solid on the documentation, and then the lifting from there happens. So, but with Vagabond Princess, because I'd already been 20 years into this world, I mean, I will say this slightly hesitantly. I don't want to say that I know all the documents, but I do know a fair bit. So I was actually reading, I was working through the archive and writing simultaneously with that. And that has now become my form. I just, as soon as I, partly because the frames are clearer to me, the structure. I mean, I usually, with every book now, there is a bigger frame, there is a bigger arc or architecture. There's a story I have in mind, storyline. And then there are 8 chapters. So there is kind of, work going on about sorting out chronology, movements, character. There are intense geographies here, that I have to work through. Those sorts of things, textiles, events. And quite quickly, I think I'm able to make a picture in my mind. And then for each chapter, this began with Vagabond Princess in Sweden. So just to give you a concrete example, this is the most itinerant woman. She's she's the only woman Mughal historian of the empire, called Gulbadan, or Princess Rosebody. And her way of thinking, in a way, this very peripatetic way of thinking, really inspired me. So one of the major sort of contributions of that book is when she leaves India and sets out on this very adventurous pilgrimage towards Arabia. So when I got to Sweden, I was writing that chapter on when she leaves from India, that is, she boards the ship for, that they would cut through the Arabian Ocean, go through the Indian Ocean, and onto the Arabian Peninsula. And in Sweden, I was at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies. And quite early on, we were gathered there for lunch, we fellows. And there was a beautiful 16th century painting of a ship that just caught me. And that became the visual in my mind. And so as soon as that got imprinted in my mind, I began writing that chapter. I began asking myself, well, what did 16th century ships look like? What were they doing for 3 weeks? What was happening? So the visual became the directing point of, the chapter. And I think that's how I've gone subsequently. There's a visual for every chapter.
What kind of revision and work does it take to go from a Cambridge University press draft to a Norton draft?
It's the most generative. So the backbreaking part, very, very tough part, and very demanding, because I think you can't make this stuff up, right? Is actually putting that first draft down. That's the hardest for me, because I kind of physically tire with that kind of thing. After that, it's a lot about, it's the most aesthetic part, in that I'll spend full days in my study when I have them, just sitting on that one visual. Say, for example, the ship, right? I will think about the words in the document. So in Persian, jahaz, for instance, right? What is the size? And quite often the shapes were like that of a camel in the front of the ship, right? Things like that. So then the rearrangements begin to take place, right? Where do you make a most effective move in a chapter, right? How do you capture a reader straight away? In Noor, for instance, with Empress as well as Tiger's Lair, my remix, the comet, the great comet, was a very lovely image. I mean, it was there as baby Noor. At that time here she was not born. Her mother was pregnant. They were leaving Iran. And so that comet became a very powerful symbol. So I began the chapter called Miracle Girl, in both cases, with this comet that was glowing overhead, and then built the story. So I think the transformation is more, at least in my own writing, more visual, more sort of very clear-cut narrative, no chronological mixing, no passive voicing. Basically being very succinct and lightening it as far as possible. And I don't mean tamping down. I mean the prose has to lighten at some point. I don't know if this makes sense.
You were just talking about how much you're evoking the visual as you're doing that revision and that work. And yet, of course, you don't have photographs to work with, which is often what historians tell me they use. What do you draw on then to really bring that visual to life for the reader?
The Mughal world, right from the start, I mean, this long dynasty that came from Central Asia through Afghanistan, and they were very drawn by traditions, Persian traditions, because that was the way to be civilized at that time. And they were very strong painterly traditions. So they came with that. Some Persian masters came along later on in India. And then, of course, India has one of the most succinct and gorgeous painterly traditions from time immemorial. And so they started blending these traditions and painting by the time of the third Mughal emperor called Akbar. He was really the man who established from the peripatetic itinerant mode to more the empire of the cities and, palaces. And he's the man who really builds the first haram of the empire that I was mentioning earlier on. And he establishes one of the finest ateliers in the painting atelier in the dynasty. And painting, so it's called miniature painting because on a small, let's say, usually, I mean, the sizes vary, but a gorgeous image of Noor loading the musket is drawn on a paper board, which is, I think, approximately 10 by 13 centimeters, something like that. But the detail is breathtaking. I mean, and this is a single portrait that was drawn of her. The Mughal miniature style was really what we call many temporalities within the same painting. That is, 3 or 4 scenes are shown taking place. So there is a birth of a royal child happening inside. Just outside the scene is this kind of, very intense activity of the messenger taking the news outside. And then there's this third scene of activity where the people are milling around and music is taking place because the news has been forecast. So, things like that. So there is this kind of, thousands of these miniatures. Some accompany manuscripts themselves, that were produced, the textual manuscripts. Some are loose folios, and they are in collections all over the world. They are in India. They are in the British Library in London, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. One of the finest collections is in the Cleveland Museum of Art in Cleveland that I've used quite a lot. But here's the thing. I mean, with painting, so I was trained. So these are these really strange demarcations people do in the academy, right? You're a historian, you're an art historian, So my training was textual. But quite early on, I began to, in a way, challenge these boundaries. And so, in order to challenge those boundaries, I sat with some immense, great art historians and began learning what these traditions were. Who was drawing? Why were they using some of the colors that they were using? What's the palette, right? How is it actually produced? All of this just made my world rich. In a way, I think my words got quite affected by the visuality of this world. It's such a rich and visual, so not only paintings, but also architecture, right? Mm. I mean, the Mughals, of course, are known for the symbol of India, the Taj Mahal. But there's kind of huge number of buildings before that all around. So it's a lush archive. And I think all of this helped with the words.
I want to ask a little bit about Tiger Slayer, which is your newest book. And you've called it a remix of Empress for young adults, which I love that way of describing it. Could you talk a little bit about how that project came about, how it came to exist?
I think writing for young adults, of course, is a craft, as is all these crafts that we've been, discussing. I hadn't really, this was not in the plan. It's not something I had ever thought about. But when I was on the road with Empress, virtually in every event that I did, somebody or the other would stand up and say, would you not write this for our girls, my daughters, young adults, right? This question kept on coming up for the 2 years that I was on the road. And during that time, in various in the literary festival called the Jaipur Literary Festival in Boulder, in Colorado, in Beirut, and in Jaipur Literary Festival, Jaipur in India, I met Molly Crabapple, who's a very fine, painter based out of New York, and we became friends. So we knew each other, and by about 22 years later, as I had just mentioned, I was in Sweden, and I did a couple of lectures there, and the same question actually came up: why not for young adults? At which point I realized this was fated, and fated because I knew. I think Molly, in a way, her presence inspired me. So we were writing letters to each other by this time. She was sending me her art, which is strongly lush and feminist and feminine. And so I called her from Sweden, and she was on straight away. So it's really the collaboration of, again, going by words, I don't like that word because I think it's very decided. So we started co-creating, and it was not that I was doing the text and I'd done the text and then she drew. This was happening simultaneously. We were discussing things. I was so going back to the visual. I was sending her all these pictures from the Mughal world, and she was studying those closely. Of course, for a very long time, she'd had very deep interest in this form, the Persian and the Indian Mughal form. As a girl, she used to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and look at these paintings. So, but her recreation, she sticks to the Mughal form in the gorgeous illustrations that she's done. She sticks very close to the iconography, and yet, creates this splendor anew in a way, which has the old and yet the new feel. We also decided that paintings were not going to be inserts, but that they would spread. So in a way, words and pictures come in conversation with each other.
Because of the recent publication of Tiger Slayer, I wanted to do something a little different so I could talk with Ruby about how she reimagined one of her books for a younger audience. I asked her to read 2 excerpts, one from Empress and a corresponding section from Tiger Slayer, so we can do a little comparison. So first, here's Dr. Ruby Lal reading from Empress Chapter 8, titled A Key for Closed Doors.
When Mihir returned to Agra in 1608, after more than a decade in the wild and open spaces of distant Bengal, the capital was even grander and more crowded than when she left. Along the banks of the Yamuna River stood many more mansions than before, surrounded by luxuriant gardens and groves. Everyone has tried to be closer to the river bank, a visiting Dutch trader wrote, and consequently, the waterfront is occupied by the costly palaces of all the famous lords, which make it appear very gay and magnificent. The sleepy village of Sikandra, just outside of Agra, was now bustling with workers, completing the tomb of Akbar. It had been renamed Paradise Town in honor of its new status as the great Mughal's burial place. The Agra fort on the western bank of the Yamuna was as imposing as ever. A drawbridge over a moat led to the fort's front entrance, Akbari Darwaza, or Akbar's door, a colossal spiked gate richly decorated with golden loops and rings. That would be the first halting point for an entering regiment, where imperial orders would be presented to the guard. The equally magnificent Elephant Gate, Hathi Pole, to the west served as the public entrance. From there, an open bazaar led to the courtyard of public audiences with the emperor. After passing through Akbar's door, Mihir and her young daughter were taken to the haram, called the Jahangiri Mahal, though it was built by Akbar. A grand garden marked the entrance of this multi-story palace for royal women, dominated by high domed turrets and separated from the rest of the fort complex by thick walls. The harem, viewed from the public courtyard or from outside the walls of the fort, was visible only as a succession of rooftops and cupolas. Mihir was 31 years old, attractive, dignified, and well trained in the behavior and duties required of noble women connected with palace society. She had visited the harem as a girl and knew she would soon be part of a restrictive existence very different from her relative independence in Burdwan. But she had no idea what her precise role there would be.
All right. And again, here's Ruby reading from Tiger Slayer, Chapter 4, titled When Mir Became Nur. See if you can hear the similarities and the differences.
When Mihir returned to Agra, the capital was even grander and more crowded than when she'd left. Along the banks of the Yamuna River stood many more mansions, surrounded by luxuriant gardens and groves. The fort of Agra, also on the western bank of the Yamuna, was as imposing as ever. A drawbridge over a moat led to the fort's colossal spiked front entrance gate, decorated with golden loops and rings. After passing through this door, Mihir and her young daughter would arrive at the front garden of the harem, a multi-story palace for royal women. Mihir was sent to the harem rather than to the mansion of her father or older brother, because both were under suspicion. The head officer of the harem would escort Mihir and her daughter to the inner areas. Lavish carvings in floral patterns decorated the walls. Vases were carved into niches and etched with leaves and flowers. Blue and red chandeliers hung from the cupola ceilings. Numerous entrances and passages connected a series of open, paved, quadrangular courtyards that were lined with trees and pots of plants and flowers and surrounded by verandas. Behind the verandas were the royal women's apartments. Every apartment was spectacularly decorated. There were domes of sandstone, arches so intricately carved that they looked like netting. Although each passage, courtyard, and set of rooms had a distinct style, they were in harmony. Mihir had visited the harem as a girl. Now she was 31 years old. Attractive and dignified, she knew the behavior required of noble women connected with the palace, but she had no idea what her role there would be.
Well, perhaps the most obvious difference between these two versions of the story, as listeners might guess from the different chapters that are here, is that Tiger Slayer is shorter. How did you think about what should change and what should stay the same as you were remixing, and what could be taken out?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, so it's, chapter 8 and 4 already tell you the difference. Mm-hmm. But also Empress is just, technically speaking, it's about 85,000 words plus. And Tiger Slayer is 31 point something. So, but the important thing as I was writing, and again, this speaks to the form, I didn't want to tamp down the story. I don't think of young adults as half adults. They are young people where they are. And, apart from the aesthetics and the beauty and the power of the story, there is also the politics around this work that I do, which is that because nominally the Mughals were Muslim, although they were very experimental and very multi-denominational and playful. But because, they are a Muslim dynasty, they've been wiped out from school textbooks and college curriculum over the last, they've been slowly being wiped out and now completely done because of the demand of the Hindu right-wing state in India. And so, I see my task as a task of responsibility and of memorializing this history, but in a way that not only that the books are available, but that also that this history remains in the consciousness of these people, right? Of young people, because they are the citizens. Because if you gerrymander histories and books, then you're taking away a very beautiful vision of the world. So that's really at stake. That's the politics of it. But on to the decisions about a lot of the information in Tiger Slayer was also, I thought about sidebars, and we created very visual sidebars. So, for instance, instead of bringing a whole narrative on what is a harem, what is the difference between Mihir's life in Bengal versus, which is a mansion and upper class and a noblewoman, versus when she comes to the palace, instead of making the narrative heavy, I created a sidebar on the harem, right? What is the small sidebar? What is the history of the harem? And, when does it come to be, etc. This title, for instance, when Mihir becomes Noor, right? Again, it's very hard sometimes to grapple with this information that she's born as Mihirun Nisa, but then, when she marries the emperor twice over, her name changes. And it changes because of very serious reasons. It's a form of elevation, it's a form of honoring. And Noor Jahan, light of the world, is actually very deeply involved in declaring her a co-sovereign, which is what she comes to become. So some of that information, for instance, was in the sidebar. And then there are all these, delicate visuals to build the story. So here we have the weight of the pictorial and the sidebars that are doing the same amount of work. So these were some of the, I think, decisions I was taking as I was writing.
Did working with an illustrator affect the way you think about your own writing? Did you approach it differently?
So there were two sets of things that were happening, at that time when I was working with Molly. Of course, I know the pictorial archive, but when I would send her stuff, she would say, for example, but you have not sent me the seat perched on the elephant. Can you send me? So then I would think, oh, exactly where can I find that kind of thing? Or we had this really very funny conversation at one point. She had drawn this glorious scene of the harem, women learning in the harem, and she had put a cat there. And I wrote to her saying, I said, Molly, you cannot have the cat because cats don't come into the pictorial tradition till the 18th century. And then she said, okay, I'll write. So this one I can do, but once I've drawn, it's very complicated, etc. We had this exchange. And then a few emails later, I think it was the third time, I said to her, have you taken off the cats? And she was quite upset. And I said to her, I said, this is not just an aesthetic thing, because I would be taken to task if the cats show. And we quite often laugh about this, right? So I was, paying attention to things that I was holding each detail in my worldview much more actively, I think, getting even closer to paintings than I had. And I think that's what I mean. Once I did that affected the words, right? I mean, I'm often told that my sentences are very visual. It's because I'm constantly thinking through textures, and I'm thinking through, the feel of the trees, the kind of smell of the landscape. And these are very active in my writing. And by that, I mean, scholars will often think of this kind of stuff we are talking about, that is the dresses or the paintings or the buildings or the rivers or the valleys as backdrop, right? Context, to use the academic word. But I don't think of them as context. I feel it is history. I think it is the story.
In the process of remixing the story, was there anything you had to leave out that was particularly painful?
No, I think no. I think I was ready for this new form, and I wanted to work within the terms of that form, in the sense that learning about the form from many people that I've read, such as Jason Reynolds. He's particularly superb on this. But also the, Amar Chitra Katha traditions that I grew up reading. These are, the translation would be immemorial picture books. And mostly these were read both by adults as well as children in India, and they're still there. In fact, one of the scenes of when Noor goes on the battle to save the emperor, I actually, brought out the Amar Chitra Katha image for Molly, and I said we can use this because some of these things are not in the archives, right? So we had to use the archive and yet create some new pictures.
Has anything surprised you about the reception to Tiger Slayer versus the reception for Empress?
I mean, Empress, I'm just so grateful. Empress has done superbly well. And here I don't mean monetarily, right? I mean, it's done well in terms of the debate it's generated, the form, but also, writing these histories is an act of responsibility as far as I'm concerned. So to me, and both, younger men and women, various forums, I mean, it's been 7 years since Empress came out. I'm still talking about her. And now with Tiger Slayer, really, I mean, I didn't know what to expect. And it's just done, it's just because literally, a few months ago, this history was completely removed from the by the National Council of Educational Research and Training, called the NCERT in India, from school textbooks. And I think the reviewers and podcasters and the press is picking up on that because, of course, now again I hadn't planned this, but the book came out right in the thick of that debate. So I'm just delighted because, like the Amar Chitra Katha form, both younger and older people are picking up this book. And my intention somewhere along the line was to write in the genre of young adult, but I felt, I wanted both younger people as well as older people to be able to read this. In fact, I'm teaching a freshman seminar called India's Women at Emory, and I discussed the two, and they wanted to read the young adult books. So that's fantastic.
I don't want to leave Vagabond Princess out of our conversation either, because I loved it as well. And it also came out fairly recently. And I really wanted to talk about it's so compelling. It's such a good read. How do you go about creating a narrative that is so gripping when there are so many things we can't know about Gulbadan from the sources?
Just so that our listeners are clear, this is Princess Rosebody. She was the daughter of the first Mughal emperor called Babur, who was one of the loveliest poet emperors. He was dedicated to this itinerant life, and he leaves from, after various battles, etc. He was settled in Afghanistan, and then he's the man who does early conquests in India and establishes the beginnings of the Mughal Empire. And Gulbadan is in the first caravan of women, the first girl at age 6 who comes to India at the invitation of her father. And like him, she spends her life in and out of various, territories. And she is the only woman historian of the empire and writes a rather unique prose. Most women later on wrote poetry. So she, when she was older in her 50s, her nephew, the third Mughal that we were talking about, Akbar, builds the first set of haram quarters just outside Agra, which was part of the imperium of settlement, of saying, we've arrived, we are the great Mughals. And so Gulbadan, along with generations of women, is requested to live in the haram, in the sequestered cloisters, which is an act of elevation that, now you are the women of the great Mughal. You cannot be seen by any Tom, Dick, and Harry. So it's from the haram quarters that she takes this voyage along with 11 other women of the family, ostensibly for a pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. I knew all of this. I had begun my career with this woman and her book. I'd won a scholarship to go to England to study this book that is housed in the British Library in London. And that led to that haram history that I was talking about. So I knew this much. And then after Empress, so along with Tiger Slayer, Gulbadan was coming up in people's questions because as Baby Noor was making her way to India, Gulbadan was leaving with the women for Arabia. And so there's a, she's a, let's say, a minor character in Empress. And people started asking me about her. And I thought, oh my God, I mean, she really, this woman, I must write about her. But I didn't want to do just a life and times kind of thing. So there were two things that came back to me. One was, as the only copy of her book that is housed in the British Library, it breaks off mid sentence in folio 83. That was one thing that had never left me. And the second thing, as I thought deeper about this book, I found out that she had actually, along with the women, lived in Arabia for 4 years. And in those days, you could make those trips and be back, between 1 month to 3 months. And I thought to myself, my God, what were these women doing for 4 years? And so the thing I had to do was to move from the Mughal world to learn the sources in Arabia. And I found out 5 eviction orders against her that are housed in the National Archives in Turkey. And basically, the women had gone about, it was very raw times. And, Arabia, including the holy cities, were under the protection of the Ottomans of Turkey, a man called Murad III. He was a contemporary of Akbar. And it was because they were not Arab, because the holy cities had become theirs by conquest. So they had to make an argument for why they should rule. And the argument was basically that they would be the servitors and protectors of all. And here you had the harem women of Akbar the Great for 4 years handing out bounty to all and sundry. So the generosity becomes a very, very big ground, because literally that would mean that they're walking in the footsteps of Murad. So this became the story I wanted to write. So I think, to your question, then, this detail is, I think, important in understanding, how then to do this kind of gripping history. The history itself is gripping, right? So I wanted to think, it made it more gripping for me because the bulk of the book is about that time in Arabia, which nobody knew until now what had happened. So that was very exciting. But also, what did travel look like? Where all did they go? So the pilgrimage in 16th century was totally different, I found out, from what we know of it today, right? There were tons of other things that these women, were doing. And what was Arabia like? I mean, it was so interesting to learn about all of that. And then they return. I mean, they did not want to return home. This is stated in one of the documents. So for me, it became a question about, I believe she left the harem on the grounds of wanting to do the pilgrimage. That was part of the world, and surely she wanted to do that. But it was also this commitment to an itinerant life, to not wanting to be cloistered, to once again, even for a few minutes or years, experience what being in the open country would mean, something she was used to. And I believe she would come back transformed. And I think the missing pages are to do, I believe they have something to do with this journey as I discuss.
In the last bit of our time together, I'd like to ask a little bit about your inspirations. Do you have a writing community or a group of writers that you turn to for feedback on your work?
Yeah, I had a very long-standing, till Empress, I had a very long-standing group of colleagues, 3 of them. They were all experimental. They are all experimental themselves. And we met monthly to read each other's work, and it was really fantastic. Towards the end, I did something I practice. We all have our practices. I'm a great fan of yoga, and I have 3 friends in my yoga circles who are not academics, and so they were very fascinated by this history when I began telling them what I was doing. And so one of them started housing us for monthly potluck dinners. And I would read the chapters aloud as I was writing. And I think that reading aloud is an extraordinary practice in writing. You know where you're getting stuck, you know where things are not working, the moves are not right, right? And just listening, the reactions were really quite extraordinary. But increasingly, I think it's become more and more a solitary exercise. I think I'm getting more into that space where I show work very late. I guess more hesitation as you're writing more, or perhaps getting deeper into the craft. I don't know.
What's the most influential writing advice you've ever received?
Actually, from my agent, she said to me at one point, if there is a writer or a book you like, just take one passage and read it out many times, and then try to see if you can, without reading again, replicate something like that in your writing. And I think that was wonderful. Of course, it's changed a lot for me. I usually, my evenings are almost always reading all kinds of writers that I deeply admire. And, one of them, I think the top for me, who I actually, discovered only in 2022. In fact, after I'd written Vagabond Princess. Or, no, actually, I was finalizing Vagabond Princess. And I think that last chapter called The Books of Gulbadan is inspired by this great Polish writer. Of course, I read her in English. Her name is Olga Tokarzuk. And, her phenomenal The Books of Jacob. It's a 936 pages long book, as the Swedish Academy said this is her magnum opus. She's phenomenal because, I have an affinity with her. She's very interested in figures and spaces in movement before the nation states. What was it like for people who were roving? The world of manuscripts, the world of eccentrics, particularly eccentric women. And so this is somebody and also she challenges these boundaries of fiction and nonfiction. She's very deeply historical. So I'm a great, great admirer of hers. I've recently been reading, and I think I've pretty much read most books of Teju Cole, who I think is a brilliant essayist. And of course, he writes, very beautifully on photography. So a very different pictorial mode from me, nonetheless. I think there are thoughts that are very compelling. The great Walter Benjamin, particularly, of course, there's tons of very serious and dense academic volumes, but he's written a lot on storytelling. And so I visit his pieces a fair bit. Very complex thinker from India. She's one of our most phenomenal feminist thinkers, Gayatri Spivak, who teaches in Columbia, not for writing, because her writing is extremely abstract. But I love to sit with her works because it's extremely inspirational. I mean, how lovely to be talking about this, right?
Yes.
I can sit here and talk to you nonstop about the books I love.
Well, those are wonderful, wonderful writers you've mentioned. I know that you are quite busy right now talking about Tiger Slayer and continuing to talk about your other work. But you did hint that there are future books in your life. I certainly understand if you were taking some time not to write right now, but do you have future projects that you are beginning to dabble in?
Actually, it turns out I do. And I'm both fatigued and I'm very excited. We just struck this deal with Basic Books, Hachette in New York, with a really tremendous, I think, visionary editor. So I will be writing a deep history of the Taj Mahal. That's my next project. There's kind of fabulous writings on the Taj Mahal, on its architecture, on the documentation, reception. I want to dive deeper into, this was built as a memorial to Shah Jahan's wife, called Mumtaz Mahal, who dies while birthing her 14th child. So like I said about human beings, who was she? Who is he, right? What steps of the making of grandeur does he walk in? What's the situation? I mean, he's forlorn at her death, right? He cries so much that he begins to wear glasses overnight. I mean, there's some, so I want to, as with all my works, I want to deepen, I want to just write about the moment, from the moment of her death till the Taj is fully on the river. And I must say, so he is the stepson of Noor Jahan, our empress. And the Taj is inspired by the mausoleum that Noor Jahan builds for her parents, which is just across the river from the Yamuna. And ironically, today, people, in Agra, where it is, they call Noor's parents' mausoleum the baby Taj, which I think the Taj is the baby Taj in some senses. So yes, I'm writing a book on the Taj Mahal. And there are 2 others that are commissioned, also with basic books. After the Taj Mahal, I think I will probably write a big narrative story of the entire Mughal Empire. And if I'm still alive and not completely drained by writing books, then of course the magnificent 13th century Queen Sultan Razia of Delhi. Her father was a slave, and he becomes the first Muslim emperor of Delhi and then nominates his daughter to the throne. Her story is pretty tremendous. So these are things that are brewing. I mean, I think it is just fantastic to be living amidst these. But like I said, I'm excited and extremely nervous.
Well, having read these books, I am eagerly awaiting each of those. Dr. Ruby Lal, thank you so much for speaking with me. It has been a pleasure and a joy to talk about writing and books with you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you again to Dr. Ruby Lal for joining me for this episode, and thanks to you for listening. You can find show notes and links to the books we talked about at draftingthepast.com. Like I said, I have many more great interviews coming right up, so if you enjoyed this conversation about writing history, please subscribe to the podcast and tell a friend about it. If you'd like to support the show even more for $0 a month, consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. It's a great way to help people find Drafting the Past. Until next time, remember that friends don't let friends write boring history.